In this lesson, we're going to be reviewing what happens when we add and subtract negative numbers. The main thing we're going to need to remember in order to do this is our strategies that can be used when we're adding or subtracting involving negative numbers that we've already done. So when we're subtracting a bigger number from a positive, like here, 1 take away 4. And so we're starting down here at 1 and we're going down 1, 2, 3, 4. And remember, as we go down, we're going down towards 0. So it takes us 1 to get to 0. And then we just see how many's left over. And that's how far negative we'll be going. So it takes this many to get to 0. So once we've gone that many, how many are left out of the ones we're subtracting? In this case, there's 3 left, so we get to negative 3. The next one was if we were subtracting a negative from a negative, like we are here. And so negative 2 take away 3, we're at negative 2, and because it's take away, we're going further away from 0. So that means basically the numbers here, they're going to build upwards. And so I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, I'm going to build upwards to negative 5. So if I'm taking a negative, subtracting from a negative, it means I'm moving this much further away from 0 than I started. So I'll end up at negative 5 there. And if I am adding to a negative, so like this one here, how far is it to 0, and then how much further do we get? So from here, if I'm at negative 2 and I'm adding, I'm going in this direction, which means once I get to 0, how much further have I got to go? Because however much further I've got to go, that's going to be my answer. So if it's negative 2 plus 6, then it means, of course, I've got 2 to get to 0. Whatever that number there is, that's how many it's going to take me to get to 0. And so then I'm thinking, well, how many are left over once I've taken the 2 away from the 6? And so I've used up 2. How many more to go until I've got 6 done? And of course, it's 4. So that's why the answer there is 4. We could instead have the situation where I've got something like negative 5 plus 3. If I start at negative 5 and I add 3, notice I don't get to 0. I don't pass it. I just end up at negative 2. And so I can tell that happens where if I sort of don't look at this negative for a sec, which one of these two numbers is bigger? And it's the 3. Sorry, the 5 is bigger than the 3. And that tells me that there's too much negative here. I'm not going to be able to get into the positives. And so all I've got to do is work out how far away from 0 will I end up. And so again, I'm trying not to look at the negative here. If I just go, well, 5, I'm going to be moving 3 towards 0, and so how many's left over? There's 2 still to go, isn't there? And so negative 5 plus 3 in that case is just negative 2. So if we don't actually get to the 0 when we're adding to a negative, we end up asking, well, how far away are we from it still? Because that's going to be our answer. So let's see what happens when I add or subtract negative numbers. And we'll start with this one, 2 plus negative 5. And so I'm going to use the number line just to be able to do this nice and visually here. So we're going to start at 2. Now, if I was just plussing 5, I'd go up 5. But I'm not plussing 5, I'm plussing negative 5, and so I can't get the same answer as if I was just plussing positive 5. And so what actually happens is I go down instead. And so if I'm at 2 and I want to add negative 5, normally adding would be this way, but because it's a negative, I go that way instead. So I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now notice that's just exactly the same as taking away 5 there, because I've started at 2 and I've just gone down 5. So 2 plus negative 5 is exactly the same as 2 take away 5, and so you can use whatever strategy you want to work out that that is negative 3. So if you're adding a negative, it's actually just the same as subtracting. And the next one is if we're subtracting a negative, and so 2 take away negative 5, so I'd start at 2 here. Now, because I'm subtracting, normally I'd go this way, but again, because it's a negative, I'm going to have to do the opposite, so I end up going this way instead. So up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so I end up at 7, and so that means that 2 take away negative 5 is 7. Notice that I've just done exactly the same as I would do if I was just adding 5. And so subtracting a negative, we end up doing exactly the same as if we were just adding the two numbers together. So that's actually just 2 plus 5 gets me 7. So if we're subtracting a negative, it's actually just the same as adding. A common mistake you see when people do this is when they're doing -4 take away 2, and they figure, well, there's two negatives there, and so that actually becomes +4 plus 2. But it doesn't work that way. Those two negatives aren't right next to each other there. And so it's not like this one here where we're taking away a negative. This one is a negative number, take away 2. It's not take away -2. And so this one, the two negatives won't change. That'll just be what we would have seen last lesson, just a normal negative take away a number. So make sure you look out for that. It's only when the two negatives are right next to each other, or the positive and the negative right next to each other, when you're adding and subtracting, that you'll be changing that sign. Let's take a look at some examples now. And the first one's 4 plus -3. And notice they've put the little -3, they've put it in brackets here. That's something the textbook does there. And when you write down the question, you're actually not going to bother writing the brackets down. You can just write it down as 4 plus -3. Because those brackets are just around a single number, they don't really make any difference there. It's just the textbook trying to make it clear to you that it's a negative number, but I think it looks pretty clear here as well. So we can just write it down like this. And so we're working out 4 plus -3. Here we're adding a negative, and so that is just the same as subtracting. So that plus minus just becomes a minus, and so it's really just 4 take away 3, which is now really easy, is just 1. In the next one, we're doing -5 take away, and again they've got the brackets there around the -2, so when we write down the question, we are not going to write down the brackets. Now notice this negative's out here all by itself. These are the two that's together, so this is where it's minus a negative, and so this is the one where we can turn it into a plus, just like we talked about before. So that becomes plus. So now this one's still here, so it's -5 plus 2. And using our strategies, we can work out that that is equal to -3. Now in this next one, we have to find the missing number in 3 plus something equals -4. Now if I just try and use positive numbers here, it's not going to work. 3 plus 1 is +4, 3 plus 2 is 5, 3 plus 3 is 6. I'm getting further and further away from -4. And so the answer isn't going to be a positive. I actually have to subtract. If I want to go from 3 down to -4, I'm actually going to have to subtract from that. But I've got to deal with this plus sign here. I'm not allowed to just get rid of it. So let's start by writing down the question. And notice when I write down the question, I write down the box as well, just so that when I go to check my answers, I know what I'm looking at here. And so what we're going to need to put in this box is a negative number, because if I add a negative, that's where it'll turn into a subtraction, which is what I want. And so I've really just got to work out, what would I have to subtract from 3 to get down to -4? And we can use any one of the strategies that we want to work that out. I go, well, it takes me 3 to get down to 0, and then I've got to go another 4. So that was 3 and another 4 is 7. So I'm taking away -7. And so notice that I've got -7 there. And that turns this whole thing, the plus and the minus, into a negative. So I just end up going 3 take away 7, which is indeed gets me to -4. So my final answer in the box was -7. Let's give it a try with some practice questions now. Remember to pause the video until you're ready to see the answers. And there are the solutions to these. In the first one, because it was subtracting a negative, that meant I had to change it to addition. And so I circled them. I said, well, that's really just addition there. And so I just worked out 6 plus 1, which is 7. In the second one, this time I was adding a negative. And so I wrote the question down without the brackets, and there was that adding a negative right there next to each other. And when you add a negative, it's the same as subtracting. So I just circled those, and I said, well, they're both just the same as a subtraction. -1 take away 3 is -4, because I'm at -1 and I'm going 3 further into the negatives, and so that's -4. And in this last one here, I had to find the missing number in here. Now if I go 2 take away something, then if I just use positive numbers, 2 take away 1's 1, 2 take away 2 is 0, and I'm just moving further and further away from 6. So in order to get from 2 to 6, I actually have to end up adding. And since there's this minus here, I'm going to need a negative in here, because when I subtract a negative, it turns out to be doing adding, which is what I want. And so what do you have to add to get to 4? Sorry, to get to 6, and the answer is 4, which means my answer in this box had to be negative 4, so that when I combined the minus that was already there with the negative that I put in the box, it ends up adding, and 2 plus 4 is 6. Here is some more practice questions for if you needed another go at some of them. Remember to pause the video. And there are the solutions. Hopefully you had no problems this time, but remember, if you do need extra help, make sure you ask. And that is the end of the lesson.